I didn't find any keepers. Did you all find any keepers?
All right, I am going to get us started. It's my great pleasure to welcome everybody to the UB Institute for Learning Sciences talk series. Many of you have been here before and many of you are new, and I'm especially glad to see new faces. We are very lucky today to welcome Dr. Jim Slotta from the University of Toronto. I had to look it up because he has so many titles. He is currently the President's Chair in Knowledge Technologies at U of T, but previously was the Canada Research Chair in Education and Technology. Jim is one of those scholars who isn't afraid to roll his sleeves up and build things. And you'll see some of that in his talk today, but it's also evident in his long history of contributions to not just individual educational technologies, but platforms for learning through technology dating back to the early days of the web. He's also a very well-regarded scholar in cognitive science, has made a number of contributions to how we understand conceptual change. He has built some of the most cutting-edge web-based learning technologies, and he's here today to talk to us about smart classrooms and learning communities. And so I hope no matter which discipline you're from, that you'll find some way to relate to the work. Thank you for coming, Jim Slotta.
Great to see so many people. I am getting feedback from my own computer, which I think I just did the right thing and turned it off. I do hear echo. Do you?
Yeah, that's just it's the sound of you being amplified.
Okay, that's comfortable. We'll get used to it.
Yes.
So, yeah, very, very nice to be here. And I've been told that UBills only has one L, and that I'm revealing my football allegiance, because Toronto, Buffalo is our team, just so you know. And I'm sure that the Toronto Blue Jays are your team. So we'll be comfortable in this relationship across the border. Oops, I'm going to use this. Okay. So the work I'll present today is from a pretty large and ever-changing group of scholars, PhD students, master's students, teachers, designers, developers, actually school leaders. I've been working mainly in K-12 for my career, mainly in secondary, although some primary. I'll present today a project from grade 5-6. But as well today, I'll talk a little bit about the work we've started in higher education to help understand how teachers can learn new ways of teaching and learning. So where I work, we prepare 1,000 teachers a year, and someone's got to do it. But doesn't mean we know what we're doing, or that we should stop learning how to do it better. So I'll get to that work toward the end of the talk. Just to start recognizing what a lot of people have recognized in K-12 and generally speaking in education. Let's see, right. I'm looking at a Zoom screen share of this. It's disconcerting. That the world is changing. And I think AI, you might as well rename AI as the great disruptor. It is probably going to be responsible for more changes than the web was responsible for. And imagine how the web changed travel, business, commerce, government, education. One thing that has not changed much in spite of the web, and Chris mentioned some of the things I've worked on over the years, is the kind of classroom teaching and learning that there are books and books about how that just seems to resist radical transformation. And that's true in higher ed as well, although higher ed probably has a little bit more innovation lately, but it's still profs lecturing to students, you're going to get a good grade and hopefully a better grade than him. And, how good did you learn, right? This kind of partitive model of learning, this kind of didactic model of teaching. And yet, everyone, the pundits and the scholars and the policymakers and the politicians are saying, we got to start preparing these students. That's the old model is an industrial era model, right? And built around a military paradigm. Sit in rows and like you saw the talk from Ken Robinson, right? So how do we move to focus on these kind of we call competencies, right? 21st century competencies, which you could argue are as important as content learning, especially now in the AI age, where content is even more in your pocket and even more situated than it ever has been. So it's a good question. And many scholars, Chris and I share a kind of heritage in this work from his PhD projects and my postdoctoral work. We're focused on this idea of multidisciplinary inquiry. Inquiry is learning that's not didactic, that's kind of project-based, that is, tends to be student-centered or group work where you're moving, I mentioned here, away from covering topics and focus usually on themes. Social scientific issues have often been a theme. But lately for me, it's been like water and health and cities and sustainability. Just an example, I've been doing quite a lot of work in China the last few years, where there's a great big movement on changing the educational system. I know that might surprise some of you to hear that, but when the ministry in China makes new policies, they actually tend to happen in the schools. And so we have been, after years and years of sort of pretending to do work in China, I'm suddenly seeing all this kind of uptake of these ideas. And here's one where the kids are working across 3 different teachers in a Guangzhou high school to design and construct a sustainable future city for South China. And they're using passive architecture and traditional Cantonese architectural knowledge to do those designs. Just an example. But what I'm here to talk about today is thinking about these rooms. So I'm a big fan of rooms. I'm a big fan of objects and material in general. If you don't know me, I pay a lot of attention to those things. And the room that we're in is always underappreciated and usually underutilized as a kind of coordinator and let's say co-teacher. There are books, about this. There's one called The Third Teacher that actually talks about the role of the physical space in learning. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And one way to understand it is through the lens of HCI, which is the field of human-computer interactions. And they usually start like architects do in thinking about the interaction patterns in the room. And what are these kind of patterns? We see students collaborating, talking, debating, teachers having discussion with students, not necessarily lecturing them. Sometimes they might pull back and have a mini lecture or just talk to you guys about specific content ideas. Challenging the class, asking questions. Students would be using diverse technologies, students learning from one another, teachers learning from students. So these are new patterns for classrooms, and it requires more than just thinking about the room. It requires thinking about the kind of epistemic frame of learning that you follow. And what I mean by that is, what's your view of knowledge? What's your view of learning? What's your view of the discourse patterns that are related to knowing and learning? And so one of the movements that's come out of our field, learning sciences field, is the learning community approach. It's not as common or as big of a movement as you might believe in. I'm hoping that it will sort of pick up as we go forward here into the 21st century. But essentially, those who did launch this movement, I think, should be given, kind of more credit than they have received of being visionaries, of really thinking about profound new ways of understanding learning. So learning community approach, we all understand ourselves as the learner. I'm invested in your learning. Your learning will depend on something she does. We all see it not about our own personal advancement as much as our collective advancement. Okay, so there is, I mentioned here, focus on collective progress and a value of peer efforts. Student contributed materials. These are radical and epistemic shifts from the old days where the teacher or the prof was in charge of the content and giving it to you, and here's your homework set, and here's your WISE project, and to the new era where it's Wikipedia, which starts out empty and ends up the most important and authoritatively, quality resource on the planet from our respective contributions. Tends to, focus on sort of heterogeneous activity patterns in the room, not necessarily all of us only talking together as a class, but working on small things, sometimes jigsawing, where we do different pieces, parts, and reconfigure. And then another thing mentioned by several of the scholars that I list here up above is that a focus on a different kind of discourse of learning. You could say that's tertiary, but it's actually super diagnostic of whether or not this is a learning community, is how we talk about our learning and what kind of voice we have. And there's other kinds of practices as well, but I don't have a lot of time to dive deeply into that. I want to mention pedagogical models. There aren't many, especially for learning communities. Fostering communities of learners is one. A model is something that sort of has productive constraint, design principles, things that you can, if I design an activity, I can look at it and sort of test whether it fits the model. The model could have sort of a capacity for assurance, for example, of learning. If I design something, then I can say, well, if I fit the model, then I can make sure that there's accessible outcomes. So these things have become one of my interests, and I've got my own model. They can essentially guide the design of these collective inquiry. How do I design for a learning community? Ready? Go. Yeah, it's not easy. It could turn into chaos, right? And especially if you're a K-12 teacher and somebody tells you should teach and learn this way, you're a sort of high school teacher in physics or chemistry or bio or math or history, any of them, that's risky. And that doesn't work for more than a day or two before you quit when you don't have a good approach. So here's a model that I developed 15 years ago called KCI, Knowledge Community Inquiry. There's a lot of papers on this, so I'm not going to dive deep into it. But essentially, just from a boxes and arrows view, you see that there's some collaborative knowledge construction that happens. And this can take a lot of different forms, but ultimately it produces a community knowledge base. This is a knowledge base that we have pride in, that we have ownership of, that we take identity in, that we created it. Yeah, we got the web too if we want it, but it's our knowledge base and it's indexed to the learning goals that we're after. So that means you've got to design that knowledge base if you're the teacher or the researcher. Then you got those magic red box in the middle called scaffolded inquiry. And this is activities that I design that may have to be unbound activities because there's that feisty green box at the bottom the red box at the bottom that says, the community voice has to come into those activities too. I can't just tell you what to do. If I'm doing a good job of it, you have to help guide, I have to listen and make those activities fit your interests. But overall, and that with also the content expectations, you end up with these good activities that magically produce accessible learning outcomes, drawing on the knowledge base. That doesn't give you all the answers, but it is a model. And I have used it quite a lot in probably a couple dozen PhD studies over the years. And I did have a full example I was going to roll through, but I ran out of slides, so I had to chop something. I almost feel like talking about it.
Give us the teaser.
Without slides, it was a really interesting one that happened in the age of when wikis were new. And it was a 9th grade class with 5 sections of teachers. No one had ever done anything like this before. I didn't read about it. I don't think anyone had. The teachers had never heard of this before. They had never used wikis before, but they were teaching a health science body systems course. And it was actually, I think it might have been bio. But anyways, it was 9th grade, and you were studying, diseases and body systems. So respiratory diseases, circulatory diseases, digestive diseases. And what we did was we said, okay, let's let the students, create wiki pages for all the diseases. So we'll count off by 3, respiratory, digestive, circulatory, respiratory. And we built these tools for them. Now we have Google Docs. Back then we had a wiki, and we built a little Java front end that let them sort of radio button, respiratory, and start a new disease and name it and say who they were. And then they created the beginnings, or the sort of, started to fill in our headers. So this is that structure of the knowledge base. What are the causes? What are the symptoms? What are the connections to Canada? What are the connections to other diseases? And they got about 15 minutes into that, and then class was over. But then the next period came in. There were 5 sections of this course. And, they picked up. And meanwhile, there's circulatory people and digestive people. And by the end of I think it was one class day. So just those 5 sections working on that wiki, they had made 22 wiki pages of diseases in all 3 of those systems with lots of editing. By the time the 5th period came in, they're like, it's all done. I can't find, emphysema, asthma. Well, then you should, review it and critique it and all this. So the teachers, by the end of it, in just 45 minutes, had all their students create this knowledge base. Then we had them come in the next day and create, but you only knew about circulatory, not digestive and respiratory. So we had you as a circulatory expert create 2 challenge cases, or let's do respiratory. And you're supposed to be creative. And so you came up with Snow White and the 7 Smokers. And they were, blood coming out of their ears or whatever the symptoms were. And you made 2 of those, and then you had to go solve one each from circulatory and digestive. And the only way you could do that was go to that knowledge base and looking through all of the diseases. By the end of it, everyone, and we had said just do 2, but you could do more if you want. They all did plenty of these things. The teachers were amazed. And so really in like 2 or 3 class periods, we had this really cool collective 5, not just for my class, but for 5 classes, exercising these ideas, developing challenging disease profiles, and then solving challenge cases. So I should have left those slides in. Okay. And we got findings. We got improved test scores even, which is rare in our fields to see an improved, biology score. Challenges. Okay. So these are the ones that the model can sort of help you with. How do I cover and still do this kind of depth versus breadth treatment? How do I support these complex interactions? Teachers will love the idea, but they'll be disempowered by having to put students in groups, having to distribute materials, having to check and do real-time changes, right? It's not as easy as lecture. There's a reason we lecture, we keep control and we keep, monitoring, and we can ask questions and accountable talk. So once I get into inquiry and projects and collaborations and, conditions of when you're going to change groups, and this is something a teacher might, and even an advanced teacher might get, but still have trouble doing the actual we call orchestration of the inquiry. Assessing, like here I go, how do I assess you? Because your mom still wants to know if you're the best kid in the world to get into Ivy League school. And then supporting teachers and students to change how they think about learning. I do not recommend getting into learning communities if the students are expecting traditional didactic forms of learning. It's really a tough sell. And they're like, is this due on the test? And when is the thing? So you need everyone to kind of do that epistemic shift. Scripting and orchestration is sort of the kind of deep structure of the talk I'm giving today. It's a subdomain of the learning sciences. There's again a pretty substantial record of work in scripting and orchestration. More theory, I'd say, than sort of working examples. But essentially, a script is a specification of the flow, who the roles, the materials, the conditions, even the interaction patterns. You can think of it as a theater script. Exit stage left, and the cup is sitting on the table. And orchestration is when that theater becomes real. And I don't know if you've ever planned a kind of learning activity or any kind of major event, and then the day that it actually happens is so, exciting to see what your plan actually really looks like. And teachers, of course, probably know this feeling. But orchestration is what helps this script become made real. And obviously the orchestration will probably change the script, sometimes for the better. Teacher might realize on the fly, things to do. In order to support that orchestration, we will develop technology environments. So I'll show you some of those today. But also some back-end stuff, like I can have a server in the sky. Smart classrooms are not rooms that turn the lights off when you leave, right? They're rooms that know who you are, where you are, who you're working with, what you're working on, and maybe they can support particular kinds of interactions in the classroom. And Chris and I were talking this morning about maybe this doesn't have to even be in a room, right? This could be in a hybrid environment, in a distributed environment, in a community context. But no matter what, the smarts are tracking the people and their products and their interactions, and the ambience is showing reflections of that can actually be very powerful in guiding discussions. So yeah, smart classrooms orchestrating. I'm getting ahead of myself here. And there's different kinds of approaches and thinking about learning that you can do in this regard, including, IoT stuff, embodied forms of learning. I like to call emergent learning objects. These are things that kind of take shape only as we're all doing it. The knowledge base is one crude example of that. Let's kind of keep going at a pace here. A role for multimodal learning analytics. Probably some of you have heard of this learning analytics. There's a couple of different kinds of learning analytics. There's the kind that tells you where the flu is coming based on searches for cold medications and these kind of large data mining type applications. But there's also real-time learning analytics that can tell me when a group is done or when a group might be good to go to another group, And these are things that can be analyzed in real time, especially with intelligence that we have now at our fingertips. Guide community progress, respond differentially to students. And intelligent agents have been a favorite of mine for a decade. We talked about agents for a long time, executing pedagogical scripting logic. These things have gotten much more interesting in the last 2 years. I'll tell you that right now. Everyone's excited about AI. So am I. I'm going to jump into an example here that illustrates how we made this, how we made a classroom an interesting space for grade 5, 6 kids. And I'm going to show a picture of my friend and colleague here, Tom Moore. He's at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's very interested in spatially and temporally immersive phenomena. So this room is actually a submarine under the water. I don't care what you say. That's what this room is. Or a spaceship flying through. Or there's actually earthquakes that are happening under the room and we have to measure wherever they're happening. Or in this case, there's insects crawling around all of the walls in the ceiling. You can't see them on the floor, but they're there. Okay, grade 5, 6ers, they're there. So that's called walkology. And he calls that embedded phenomena. And essentially you can see why. It's a phenomenon that's embedded. And so here's a picture of 2 kids. Oh, you can't see these bugs unless you have a wall scope on the wall, right? So presumably this will play. Nope. So our friend in the back room is going to hit play now. And this just shows a screen grab from that wall scope. And this thing goes for 24/7, okay? And there's nothing interesting that happens here, except unless you happen to see something interesting. So these eggs will hatch. Somebody will eat somebody. Crumbs will fly, right? Something else will come in. And the walls, by the way, they all differ in terms of temperature, habitat, humidity, okay? There's a master food web, 23-something species, and they're kind of subsets of those depending on their affinities for those conditions. Okay, so the students come in and the teacher says, oh. The idea here, in case you don't get it, is like it's a little bit like if you send them out to the playground. You want them to understand food webs and life cycles and ecology and habitat and biodiversity, right? Grade 5, 6. But if I sent them to the playground, there's nature out there. There's nature out there. But it's like an ant chewing on a piece of gum or a dead thing, and that you don't have access to the conceptual space that this ecology can allow. So now we're in the kind of game world, for those of you who like games for learning, serious games for learning. How do we figure out this thing? The teacher doesn't know. Okay, why don't we do this? Let's all figure out the life cycles first, because each one of these creatures has an egg, a pupa, a larva, and an adult. Or maybe the pupa and larva are switched. And then they all have, habitats and food. But let's start by just looking at their life cycle. Anytime you see something happen, and if I had this video on my screen, I'd scrub forward till you saw something happen. I think this is like a 4-hour screen grab. But kids just run around. No, so you just run around the room and find anytime something changes into something. Okay. Well, okay. So we eventually changed the graphics on this and turned it into Unity 3D, but it's the same concept. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. How do I collect that observational data? How do I get your observation that this egg turns into this, pupa, and you just found this larvae turned into this adult? And you're all doing it times everywhere, times everything, times everyone, right? You're all got little, well, what should you do? Should you use Post-it notes? That's how Tom started because he's a computer scientist, so he likes paper. We said, you know what? It would be great if we could kind of see it emerge as they're observing. And my student, Rebecca Quintana, wanted to look at that question. How do I design that representation when there's so many that you could design? What is the best one? How do we do this? Oops. So she designed that iPad app. That iPad was kind of new almost. This was in 2012. You literally, if you saw this turn into this, you literally took that blue thing and dragged it here. You took that green thing, dragged it there, and you hit enter. And now go find another one. So everyone's just running around observing. And they're loving it. They're learning too about these places. But how does the teacher then see that, right? So for the teacher, we designed a smart board, which is not shown here. This is a dumb board. The teacher must be a computer scientist because he also likes paper. But he also, right next to this board, had a smart board. And on the smart board, this is kind of a picture of it here, he could touch one of these and he could see everything that turned into it that kids said. Kids said. He didn't know. He didn't know this life cycle. Well, so it turns out 2 people said the little beetle bug turned into it, and 8 people said it turned into itself, and 20 of them said that egg turned into it. So do you think that's enough evidence for us to go ahead and put the paper up here that says the egg turns into and they named them all. The kids love naming them. So that's how they did it. They just had the kids do this. And if there was ever a real conflict, like 12 of you said this and 10 of you said that, does the 12 win? 12 doesn't win over 10. We don't even need to know statistics to know this is debate. And teacher loved this. So teacher says, how are we going to solve this one? We seem to have mixed feelings in the class. And then does anyone have this? By the way, this teacher was already a veteran of some of this pedagogy before. How are we going to solve this? We seem to have a debate here. So kids said, well, we could, let's focus on this one. Let's take a picture of it. Let's take a video of it. Let's, do some more observations. And so teachers kind of took this as this is that ambient display I mentioned, right? Teachers took that as a teachable opportunity. And so Rebecca actually did her PhD thesis studying the kind of discourse patterns around those representations. I'll just say a little bit of quick summary of what happened in that work. After we did the life cycle, we did the food web. Who eats what for breakfast? And they did the same kind of thing with another similar kind of tool. And they mapped all that out and they formed the master food web, which cut across all 4 of the walls. Okay, that's a knowledge base, the life cycle and the food web. And then what happened is one day they came in and we had hit all 4 walls with a disaster. Okay, so we had introduced a temperature spike on this one, and an invasive species came in and ate all the other things on this one, and invasive vegetation covered the habitat on this one. And the kids, oh, by the way, we had assigned them at that point to a wall. So you're a wall 1 person, and you named your wall and you had stewardship over your wall. And now your wall is devastated. None of your creatures are there anymore. And the kids were like, sir, a buzz was happening. Okay, is this engaged inquiry, right? We had written this all out as scripts, by the way. It was super exciting to see it happening in real. So what do we do? Well, that's what the teacher said. You're not gonna lower the temperature. So we gave them 2 things they could do. They could trap, we call it extirpation, and they could introduce new species. And this sounds a little bit like a current ecological horror story, but those are things that ecologists do. And so they basically took their stewardship and they had to go to the food web to figure out who eats the thing they have now, who lives in the temperature they had now. And they basically got to work building their new ecosystem and creating a sustainable biodiversity. So that was that. And that's been written up in a few papers you can find. It was really neat. It was really successful. And that's the kind of work that I did, I'd say, right up through about 2015, and still thinking about those kind of things for K-12 learning, deeply engaged, connected to the real world, even if kind of through a enhanced, digital simulation, but most importantly, collective inquiry focused on certain kinds of discourse and activity in the classroom, leveraging the physical space. So that's my scholarly identity, sort of. I'm going to go to active learning now more generally. So many people here have heard of active learning, flipped classrooms, and this sort of thing. There's a whole lot of higher education research that shows here that active learning, flipped classroom, who here has heard of flipped classrooms? Plenty, right? So homework at school and lecture at home. Easy to say, really hard to do. As soon as you decide you want to flip, I love flipped classrooms because everyone's like, that's what I want to try. And then as soon as they decide to try it, they figure out that what they're going to be doing in class is actually a really tough. It's not just do homework at a table. Suddenly there's a whole orchestration that needs to happen there. So, but it's happening. And MIT did the undergraduate physics this way, and North Carolina has a whole huge TEAL program this way. And I'm sure Buffalo has plenty of active learning and active learning classrooms. And they're happening in K-12 as well. Keep hitting slides on the laptop. You see all kinds of smart classrooms or active learning classrooms nowadays. This is probably could be considered one of them. There's one back here. I will mention active learning classrooms, which are not necessarily always high tech. They can be low tech, movable furniture, writable walls, color-coded furniture, maker spaces. Experiential learning could be considered as an active classroom form. Learning across contexts. There's just some images to show some of the kinds of things that you're seeing these days, none of which are lecture, none of which are didactic in that way, all of which are super challenging for the teacher and the learners. So here's a new project we started 5 years ago, but I still call it a new project because it took 4.5 years to build these rooms. Part of that was the pandemic and construction got behind and all that stuff. But essentially, we proposed that the schools are out there, the K-12 schools are building these rooms on faith, on misplaced faith, the way they were misplaced when they put smart boards in every single classroom in the UK. Oh, these are going to transform learning. We saw the video from Smart. And buying those little touch tables, right? We saw the video. That's not how that works. And that's not how change happens. But they're building these rooms and makerspaces too. And if you've ever want to see something sad, just walk by a makerspace in a K-12 school because it's just dusty, or it's being used by the tech teacher to 3D print keychains. It's just not being used deeply. Because why? It's just not a good ecological fit to what schools are doing. It takes more time, it takes more depth, it takes more thought, it takes more, an epistemic shift, right? So, but we said, all right, but we want them. The policy says we got to have 21st century competencies and we got to have, right, creation and invention and collaboration. And so there's a charter to do this. Am I wrong? I mean, in China, they said do it and they're just doing it. But in Canada, they say do it and we just don't do it. And if you ever study communities of practice, that's a really good theoretical structure for understanding why COPs don't change, right? But I feel that AI is a great disruptor, and I think these changes are coming, and these schools are already on faith building these movable furniture, writable walls, active learning classrooms. Wouldn't that be a fun place to teach, right? Teachers are all like, can I teach in the active learning room? What do they do when they get in the active learning room? Some sort of small group work, I guess, but lots of lecture and lots of traditional things, and it's not their fault. It's just a hard transition to make. So how do we, especially for an in-service teacher who has her 10,000 hours of practice, right? They are experts at what they do. Okay, so maybe let's back up. Let's go to pre-service. And this is how we won $2 million. We argued that as a teacher education institution, we should think more deeply about the third teacher, the classroom space, the pedagogy and practice of this active learning. We can't do that without the rooms for it. We don't have active learning rooms at OISE where I work. We don't have makerspace at OISE. So we wrote a grant. And the challenges we articulated for that proposal were, first of all, curricular integration. Like, how do I add this into a chemistry class? It's not an easy thing to do that engages these students in depth versus breadth trade-off sort of thing. The technology integration that we're going to need teachers to understand deeply what these technologies do that transforms knowledge, learning, representation, discourse. Integrating learning across time and context was something we were learning about with the pandemic, that, what you do for homework should come to class the next day. Why would you do homework if it's not meaningful part of the flow of activities, right? How do I have these kind of hybrid contexts that go across more time and more even like learning contexts? And then finally, using physical space. How do I do it? Is it about chairs and tables? Is it about me walking over here? Is it about the technology that focuses with beacons? Is it about embedded phenomenon? For the research questions, I'll get to in a sec. So these were architects' drawings. We had the first thing was an active learning lab that was essentially a model high school or middle school. We had both, or elementary. We had all three in the architect's vision. We had all three of these in the room, and that was to bring our pre-service teacher courses into here and teach them how to teach this way. Oh, but who's going to do that? We don't have any teacher educators who know even how to teach that way. And how are they going to teach teachers how to teach that way? We said we could do it because we wanted the money. But then we ended up having to research it. Here's the second room, was called the Advanced Pedagogy and Practice Lab. That's where I'm teaching right now. It's more of a high-tech room, and these rooms exist, I'm sure, here at Buffalo too, right? Dedicated tables that don't move and dedicated screens and whiteboards. And this one is a makerspace. Imagine a makerspace for higher education where you're bringing teachers in to learn how to teach and learn in makerspaces. I'm teaching a class in the winter called Teaching and Learning in Makerspaces, and I'm nervous about it. If I don't look nervous, I've been working hard to try to feel like a makerspace educator, and it's a really interesting challenge. I could talk a lot about it, but I don't have the time today. Some of the research questions we're asking here, first of all, what is the definition of this? How do we define active learning and makerspace learning for pre-service teacher education? What constitutes a good curriculum and assessment for that, right? Even for K-12, how can I, how do I frame active learning as something that can cover the expectations, right? How does the physical space contribute to that? What's the role of technology? So some of these were very basic questions. How do we help teacher candidates learn about this? What we know from constructivism is you build on the knowledge you had before. Well, what if the knowledge you had before is epistemically contraire? There's some work that I did long, long ago about ontological commitments. And if you're coming in with a deep commitment, and you were a student too, right? And probably a good one if you're a teacher. So you know how to learn and teach. So how do I help you shift, right? What kind of activities would be helpful for that? Sub-questions here, what commitments are they bringing with them? And even how do they understand these things? They've heard of flipped classrooms. They've heard of active learning. How do we support teacher educators who coming in with their own initial ideas about active learning, right? So these are the kind of questions we kicked off with, and just to show you what the actual rooms look like. So this was the ALL, and this is the ALL that we ended up with. Not as colorful. But oh my gosh, do the pre-service teacher educators love this thing. And what turns out what they love the most about it is just how huge it is. But they also have really transformed their teaching and learning, and they're working hard. We wrote another grant because the grant that we won was only for building the rooms. We wrote another one for researching, and we won that one to help these teacher educators develop new approaches, share those approaches with the faculty, and build a kind of professional learning community around how to teach and learn in these spaces. This is that APPL, and this is what it looks like for reals. And I teach in this one, and I'm going to show you some of the work that I'm doing to make this smart, to build intelligence into this room. Those cameras are disconcerting to me. I wish they had just been little webcams or something. Like this camera is, you don't see, but kids are very aware that there's that big camera on the wall. Still, this is what we got. And this is the makerspace as deceived, and I'm afraid that I didn't take great pictures, but you can sort of, this is the machine room unboxing still, and you can see through into the makerspace on the other side. So that's coming together. And again, we've been using that this summer. We did get most of the stuff unboxed now, and we're starting to print things and make things. And it's an interesting challenge. How do I learn with material? It's not a solved problem. It's not a solved problem. Keychains are solved. Can print the hell out of a keychain, right? But how do I make learning meaningful to you through material in ways that deeply engage you, the way those kids were deeply engaged around their wellcology spaces, right? What if they had to make a bug trap? I don't know, like figure it out, right? That's a Canadian expression. So I guess, one tangent I want to take quickly is about AI, because this all happened and then LLMs hit in 2023. And I remember some major events in technology because of my age. But I remember 1994, and I remember 2008, and I remember 2023. And all three of those, I think, are very similar in some ways, kind of our discussion last night. You knew it was big when the web hit in 94. We all knew something was big about this. Everybody talked about it. You could click and you would go to a place. Other click. You saw the comet hit the planet, right? No one had seen that kind of stuff on a computer before. I got hired at UC Berkeley to go explore this for learning, right, as a postdoc. But nobody knew that within like 3 years, we were going to be doing all our shopping, all of our, interactions, like the thing was going to basically take over the world, right? '08, same thing. We all went down to the store and bought one of these right away because you could see your visual texts and map. And like we knew it was going to be big. We just didn't know, in 3 years, I'd drive by a bus stop and see 20 people doing this. Like we'd take it to bed with us and to the bathroom, and like, that's what this was going to be, right? Everything times everywhere. Like, who knew? It didn't take long though before we figured it out. And I think that's going to be the same thing with AI. We all kind of saw in 2023, and it's the same feeling I had. So I'm pretty sure this is going to be another one of those. It's going to be something, and we don't know what. But I know kind of what I don't want. And I think it's kind of one of the rush efforts that's happening now in education anyway, is to build these tutors with the idea that everybody can like build something that'll help you learn. And a way that the intelligent tutoring, if you had told the intelligent tutoring community decades ago that this was going to happen, they might have checked their pace and said, "Whoa, we didn't really want everyone to, this is a dystopian future that Google now has in mind." Google can make a university tomorrow that charged you $10,000 a year and gave you a Stanford undergraduate degree in almost every domain with really good learning from your bedroom. And they could have an enrollment of 100 million to get a Stanford degree. Am I being recorded? What's 100 million times 10,000? Okay, so we're not gonna not see this. This is all coming, and I'm kind of sad about it. And I guess do what you can to keep the humanity, right?
Touch.
I don't want my classroom to turn into a robot place with people plugged in. And I don't want that to be the future of how we use intelligence in our learning environments. And I actually want those kids excited about their wellcology in higher education, right? Obviously, we're changing what we're learning anyway. You don't need to learn, linear algebra in case you need it, right? I mean, these things are all going to change. We don't exactly know how, but I think active learning is probably an indicator. And I think these kind of research in pedagogy and practice are where you could put your money in terms of how to find our way. And so my thoughts on AI coming in is that this learning community, these kind of smart representations, emergent representations, ambient representations, activities, place-based learning, that's where I want to go with it. Supporting collective inquiry, so this sort of humanizing role for AI. And just to kind of finish, I guess, tell you about technology that I'm now making called Scripting and ORchestration Environment. It's an agent. Yeah. I'm sure this is all getting recorded too. But scripting and orchestration is there. And I've obviously I do scripting and orchestration. So I immediately started thinking about how AI could come into that. And I've been talking about intelligent agents for more than 10 years. So quickly started working on that. And we have now a system called SCORE. It's in the beginning stages. It's essentially supporting you to define a collective inquiry script, to situate that script in a physical environment, and to orchestrate that learning. And this is an example of a script here that you might have individual, group, and whole class or cross-class activities. This is an AI architectural diagram, just to prove that we have a diagram. This is some text-sounding language to understand the kind of debates that we were having versus, monolithic versus microservices and MCP versus LangChain, and some of these things that are kind of probably pretty common in industry right now. We've fought our way through that and now have built it in a way that I'm using it in my teaching right now in that room that I showed you with the screens. So this is kind of just a shot of what it looks like when you build one of these and when you kind of populate the sort of prompts and settings. And then this is what it looks like when you see the teacher view of the screen during the enactment. So I would have that on my screen to be able to sort of see where things are. This is, I shot this with my phone, of what the students look like when they're being guided by intelligence. And yeah, this is a phone shot. They all just had their phones say, go, based on what you said in the homework, go to table 4. And then they all moved to table 4. When they got to table 4, there was material for them to work on. So how do I design these scripts? That's the trick, isn't it? That's the art. How to think about collective inquiry, how to think about using the physical space. A couple of themes I just want to kind of end with to kind of refresh and set as important points of ongoing work is thinking about collective inquiry. What does that mean for us to be inquiring about something? Scripting and orchestration as a kind of couple of complementary constructs. Pedagogical models, I value them. I think they're valuable. The scaffolding role of technology. And for place, indexing. So that happens over there. This happens over here. Here's the place you go when you want to get information about the insect food web, right? So location as an organizer, ambience, information when needed. By the way, doesn't need to be in a room, can be in a community. This can easily be situated in a neighborhood or in your pocket, right? Especially with this web-based architecture. There's some questions I had, like, what do we actually take from our room? Nothing? Well, that's whose fault is that, right? What does the room give us? If you go to an elementary classroom, it grows over the year. It becomes a representation of the community. It shows up as room 204A. And who did that? The teacher? Everybody. That might be my signal to quit. I won't show these slides, but we have started to think about how to support people to think about authoring these complicated, difficult things. There's a full journey we're imagining. I'm working with the School of Architecture and a couple of practicing architects to do this work of understanding, including using dollhouses, the actual physical representations of the room, and collaborative authoring. So we're kind of starting some of this work, storyboarding, and that's going to be her PhD project. So that's one like pretty big piece of my pie chart. There's a couple other big pieces I won't have time to talk about today. Critical action learning is another one, and wish I had time to give that presentation. But for now, I'm going to have to. I think that's the end, right? And yeah, these are just my students' shots. And thank you.
Do you have time for some questions that people want to?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm curious, like, when you see this being implemented into like K through 12 schools, specifically in like the older grades especially, do you see like the disciplinary distinctions of like how the traditional school day setup being like demolished and having it, since it's more like interdisciplinary and like applied to like different situations? And if so, I'm wondering if you think that that means that like, because I know there's concern over, covering the material, right? I've come from a math teacher background, so we're always feel like we're behind. So if we're doing this like interdisciplinary look at these things, does that like kind of negate the fact that it takes longer, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's the classic depth versus breadth trade-off, right? I cannot teach 16 major biology standards in one semester, in a 12-week semester, without doing more than one of those major standards per week. And I don't, like something's going to have to give, right? You want to ask them for depth, for like, connections and those competencies. You can't require something and then make it impossible to do. Alan Collins, 2017, wrote a book called What's Worth Teaching. Highly recommended. He's written a bunch of books. He's like one of the founders of the learning sciences, a friend of ours. I worked with him at Boston College for a couple of years. That book sets this whole discussion really well. There was a previous book called Rethinking Education in the Digital Age that he wrote with Halverson, also really good. All of that argues that we need this research. So let's pretend that schools wanted a new answer. Do we have it yet? Do I know how to teach and learn this way yet? I sure don't think so, because if somebody had it figured out, I'd go read about it. And like, so we're still like trying to understand how we could pull off a multidisciplinary smart classroom for learning communities in case and hopefully when schools are ready to bring it in. Knowledge building was a great idea, but it's really tough to implement knowledge building. I can tell you that. So I'm not exactly sure if they came to me looking for an answer, I would have a straight face say that I could give you the KCI to learn guaranteed. I mean, I have a model. Like, I'm just a lonely researcher, right? I'm trying to do my piece, but I think you can't be, as Dick Anderson would say, in a race car. You just have to keep, the learning sciences have to keep going, advancing our own kind of way of talking about these things. And K-12, like I said, with AI, we can no longer have essays in schools. Good God. What about problem sets? Gone, right? Every kid can get every problem right every time in their pocket, on their watch, with their friend. Like, it's just over. Game over, man. That's another Canadian expression. So I think that this disruption is going to happen, and I think there's going to be a lot of, good riddance anyway. So teachers haven't been able to get around this, and I think you're going to start seeing charter schools and letting all the flowers bloom, and probably some innovation, probably more in primary at first. Same as in China. Like China had it hard. China, they didn't have a minute to spare because this is China, the entrance exam for this university. But ministry passed a policy. 2 policies, one for multidisciplinary, one for competencies, and the schools get rewarded if they achieve those. So you're seeing all this kind of wonderful like experimentation. So I mean, I don't know. I can just say like this is not like you cannot operate under the other rules and boundaries with this kind of stuff. But I still don't think this kind of stuff's quite. It's going to need teachers to do it. So we have to have the 10,000, I won't call them monkeys, but we have to have all the practitioners out there trying this stuff out. And then they're going to have way better ideas than probably Walkology, right? So I have Walkology ready to share if anybody wants it. And SCORE is open source and you can take it. Good question. No
Thank
good
you.
answers.
Thank you. This is really thrilling. I have 2 questions about infrastructure, and maybe you can choose one. So one is technical infrastructure. We're moving into new facilities in a week or something, and we have this sort of learning classroom that's supposedly like very nicely instrumented with microphones and cameras and such. And it seems like this kinds of things take a huge amount of effort to construct. And I'm curious what sort of models you've seen of infrastructure for, like, on technical terms, like event-driven kinds of things where you can already have a baseline system that can collect what's going on everywhere. Maybe you can direct streams different places, and then you can build your applications on top. The second question about infrastructure, at UB, we have, I ask this question all the time. We have a really strong CSE, computer science engineering department, that's very narrow in its scope. And it's very hard to find students who have the technical skills but whose heads are oriented toward the kinds of questions you're asking. And I'm curious what kinds of models you've seen, ideas you have for sort of like next steps we might be taking to help bring those competencies together in the academic research space.
Well, computer science is in an existential like moment right now. I mean, I have my girlfriend's a computer scientist, and their department is having meetings that start with the question of whether computer science is still relevant. This is how disruptive this thing is. And of course, they want to find a way to make their department go forward. I think HCI and human-computer interactions is a really powerful subdomain and maybe poo-pooed by some of the CS community. But if you think about how kind of impoverished a lot of the interaction patterns we have for these, it's literally menus and clicking and kind of like your grandpa invented software, right? So the frontiers of how we can work with technology now, and especially with AI and things that understand our spoken language and robots and like ambience, like those things should open up this huge new space of excitement for future careers, and everybody's worried about their career. So what I'm doing right now at OEZ, we've started a kind of guerrilla underground educational experience movement to supplement the curriculum, because these students are all in their programs not getting anything interesting to do. And we've said, you know what, we're going to found this in-person community called COIL, Community for Open Innovations and Learning. And if you're a CS student and you want to be involved in programming something for like a learning environment, we can't necessarily pay you, but we can give you a line item and you can learn about appropriating some of these ideas and get your hands dirty and have pizza. So we're actually trying our best to just encourage students to kind of take a bit of control of it. They're all nervous about their future. I mean, professors are nervous about their future. We have tenure even. But yeah, everyone's kind of wondering where it's all going to go. So, I mean, I think there's an opportunity there too. As far as your infrastructure question, that's one of the things SCORE is trying to offer, is a way to quickly build stuff that could run on everybody's pockets, on any kind of devices. We do this thing called roomcasting that Tom invented, where you can just send URLs to anything, and we have agents that do all that. Making those little agents, it doesn't take much to do. You need some knowledge of how to use the system, but I was showing him earlier. So I think that's one thing I'm thinking is, if we get a bunch of people that are able to use SCORE in different ways, that SCORE becomes this kind of more robust ecology of implementations. So, hopefully we can, and Preeti's, for example, using it for her teaching large courses in CS. She's sending out programming challenges to 200 students in real time. They're coding based on their answers. They're put into groups and sent follow-up questions, right? So it's an interesting, completely different thing than what I'm doing, which is, I'm having my students all contribute misinformation examples from the web, and then they come into class, and those misinformations are aggregated and then sent out to table groups, and their students are assigned, and they're supposed to think about how to help students learn about misinformation. So a completely different kind of pedagogy. I teach media, and yeah. We need a third one. We got another one that's building a mixed reality game, student of mine, who's embedding a dystopian future in the classroom so that students can walk around and uncover like non-player characters and play role-playing games. So if we use enough diverse kind of things with SCORE, then it sort of emerges as something that's got a lot of carrying capacity without, I don't want it to be like everything, but collective inquiry is my hope, that it supports learning communities.
With that, I'm going to say thank you one last time.
Thank you.
Very much appreciate it. And if
I'll be around
anybody
up here
still
if you
needs
want
a
to come up.
sandwich, please grab one.
Yeah.
I will say also, if you didn't sign in at the front, please do sign in. It's partly so that we can prove to UB that we didn't eat all the sandwiches ourselves, but also so we can ask you to be on our mailing list. And if you're not on the mailing list, you will appreciate learning about more talks like this.